Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another IIPP seminar. So these are our Monday afternoon academic seminars that we do every Monday, basically throughout our term time. And my name is Ryan Cuttle, and I'm IIPP's deputy director and professor here as well. And I'm chairing tonight's seminar, and I'm very pleased to welcome Emily Jones as our main presenter today. So Emily is an associate professor in public policy at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, and she also directs global economic governance program at Blavatnik. And as you might have seen from her topic of the presentation, her research focus is really on the global political economy of trade and finance. And she has been over the last years also been involved in training UK government around trade issues, and has been sitting on various commissions. And as you might know, of course, trade will become, probably after COVID recovery or during the same time, one of the key issues for UK government because of the Brexit and because UK government essentially is starting and something that they haven't done for 50 years, is negotiate trade deals on their own. So I think it's an incredibly important issue that we'll discuss today. And so Emily will talk today about the way UK government scrutinizes trade deals. So something that eventually actually affects all our lives, from the prices of medicine to bananas to whatever, the way we can travel to Europe, I guess. So it's really topical. And the way we do the seminars was to have Emily present for about 35 minutes. Then we have Antonio with a first response, if you will, bring up the key issues to discussion, and we'll then open up the floor for everybody in the audience to ask questions or comments, and we try to put you in the podium so we can see you. It's less anonymous, more intimate. And yeah, if you have any questions and comments during the talk, just put them in the Q&A, and we can then put you on top. So Emily, welcome to IIPP, and I'm glad you're here with us today. So floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raina. It's really nice to be with you all and to discuss an issue close to my heart, so UK trade policy. As you've mentioned, the UK hasn't really negotiated trade deals for almost 50 years. So all of these powers are being repatriated from Brussels in the sort of mantra of taking back control. And trade agreements have become a really part of the flagship, if you like, plank of global Britain and the post-Brexit agenda. So what I want to do is I'll speak about the state of play, what's at stake in terms of public policy issues, and actually what's being negotiated. I hope that will be of interest to everybody. So just what exactly where we're at with all these trade negotiations that are happening. And then I'll speak in more detail about actual parliamentary scrutiny in the UK, which is pretty weak, as I'll explain. And I'll compare it to the EU, US, Canada, and Australia. Just sort of a bit of a heads up of where I'm going with this. Just to say the sheer scale of what's happening is pretty breathtaking on the trade agenda. So the UK is undergoing quite an extensive overhaul of its trade policy. I think certainly the most extensive of any country I've known in such a short period of time. And of course, as you mentioned, COVID on top. So the civil service is spread very thin, but the politics around it mean that there's a lot of pressure to go very fast. And I'll speak to that a bit, because I think it is conditioning the way the UK is going about it. So the presentation draws on a recent co-authored working paper, which is available on our website, which really scrutinises this sort of cross-government mechanisms through which the legislative branch hold the executive branch to account on trade policy. The paper came from my own frank surprise at how weak the UK's scrutiny processes are. I've looked at the EU and the US for a long time and was really shocked to find out how little power our parliament had. And actually no one had systematically scrutinised it, so hence the sort of value out of the paper. And just a caveat, I'm not a lawyer, so it gets into quite a lot of constitutional law issues, but I'm coming at this from a trade policy perspective. So any lawyers in the room, you can help me out in terms of the finer points of parliamentary sovereignty and law. But I think the bigger picture, I think, is very clear, and I'll speak to it. Okay, so just let me speak then to part one. So the state of play, what's at stake in terms of public policy and where the UK is at. So just if those of you who don't follow trade policy that closely, just to say that trade agreements have changed out of all recognition over the last 50 years. So 50 years ago, they really were about tariffs at the border, so the taxes imposed on imports and exports, and other border measures. And where we're at now is really they're about the way that we regulate the economy, and they touch on many, many issues. I mean, Rainer, you mentioned there sort of food, bananas and medicines. I'll add to your list. So agriculture, there's obviously the big food standards debate. We hear a lot about sort of chlorine washed chicken, pesticide levels in our grapes, things like that. Industry, so everything from sort of vehicle safety rules and chemical regulation, rules of origin, so the extent to which components have to come along the supply chain from specific countries. Services investment, how open our services sectors are to foreign investors. Quid pro quo, the extent to which our companies in the UK, being a service-driven economy, get access to other countries. So you can think about health services, a lot of concern about the role of private companies in the health sector in the UK. Intellectual property, so price of medicines, but also things like copyright. Lots of areas that are really important for technology and those of you focused on industrial policy and innovation. Digital economy, big flagship area for the UK government. So this is really where the UK looks like it's going to be focusing, which is a lot of issues there around cross-border data flows and the regulation of new technologies, including algorithms. Also how we regulate the internet. Government procurement, how open the government procurement markets are. Customs and trade facilitation, environment and labour, I could go on. Right, the point being that really they are incredibly extensive. They're also complex, right? So if you look at the recent trade agreements, they're thousands of pages long. They typically take years to negotiate. So they're quite a complex international agreements that are being entered into. So they raise some really important questions and tensions for those of us who are interested in public policy. So one which has always been the perennial one is the extent to which we open up our economy to cross-border economic flows. The UK is relatively open across most metrics. But the second dimension, that's what I want to focus on today, is more about the regulation of the economy, so the way that we regulate, which is a slightly different question to how open we are. It's more about the way that we regulate and our ability to sort of carve out, if you like, regulatory autonomy. And or align our regulations with other jurisdictions. And I'm going to talk to that. There's a lot of buzzwords around the UK's trade strategy. Despite the fact that we've now been negotiating trade agreements for 2+ years, we actually don't know much about what the UK's agenda is. There isn't yet a proper trade strategy, if you like, really setting out the medium-term agenda. There's a lot of buzzwords, there's precious little detail. Beyond which, and a sort of, if you like, a cheeky sort of quip of where the UK's at, it seems to be getting the maximum number of deals in the shortest possible time. So sort of the politics of showing that global Britain is working is driving, I think, quite a lot of what's happening. So with this regulatory question, I want us to focus on that in our discussion this evening. I think there are two big questions for us. To what extent do we as the UK want to stay with or diverge from the EU's model and regulatory approach? It's the extent that we do want to diverge, and these are some of the tensions that we're seeing now in negotiations with the EU. There's a real signal that the UK wants regulatory autonomy. How viable is that, given that the EU is sort of on our doorstep? So how possible is it in practice to diverge? Because our companies, even if we have different regulatory standards, are still going to need to meet EU standards. And to what extent, and this again is really important, are we looking as the UK to align with other jurisdictions, particularly the United States? And as I'll explain, I think there are signs with what, despite all the rhetoric of sort of taking back control and searching for regulatory autonomy, actually, if we look closely, there are quite a lot of signals of the UK realigning to a US or Asia Pacific model of economic regulation. I'm happy to go into that in a bit more depth. And I think that's particularly in the area of digital economy, which I've looked at in quite a bit of depth recently. So I think it's less about autonomy and taking back control, in inverted commas, than actually shifting of the UK's regulatory alignment from the EU to the Asia Pacific. So that's my kind of working hypothesis, if you like. The trade agreements are pretty secretive. They're happening behind closed doors, and there's not that much. It's not that clear where the UK is going, but I think that's the sort of signals that we're getting. All right, so a little bit on what deals we're negotiating and where we're at with them. So I think it's helpful analytically to distinguish between three types of trade negotiations that are happening. So the first one is the negotiation with the EU. And if you like, that's us moving from a mode of very deep regulatory alignment with the EU, where the UK was part of had co-decision making in the way that the EU economy was regulated, and us as part of that, to a shallower arm's length relationship with the EU. And in some ways, you can think of our trade negotiations as a sort of exercise in damage limitation, if you like. So on one hand, they're sort of taking back regulatory control, that ability to diverge, but at the same time, there are quite significant economic consequences of doing that. So if we look at the projected loss of moving from being an EU member state to actually being at an arm's length free trade agreement, we're looking at projections of 5% reduction in UK GDP over a 15-year period. And if there's no deal with the EU, an 11% loss of GDP. So quite significant numbers just in terms of us backing away from this deep alignment. And of course, the EU negotiations are incredibly complicated because they go beyond the normal trade realm to sort of areas of security and defence, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole panoply of issues on the table there. We've seen at the moment big discussions around the level playing field. So this whole idea that the UK wants more regulatory autonomy from the EU and wants to distance itself, and that's really the sticking point. There were rumours that we were going to get a deal by today. We're expecting it to land any day. I don't think it's going to be comprehensive. I think it's going to provide quite a lot of continuity, and I think there'll still be lots to work out in 2021. And in terms of the actual autonomy that we're now repatriating, there's still quite a lot of lack of detail on where that's all going to sit. So what we've done is we've taken the EU's regulation and incorporated them into UK domestic law. But the question moving forward is which institutions are going to have competence, for example, over chemicals, over pharmaceuticals. So we're replacing EU regulatory institutions and regulations with now we've got to come up with UK ones. So it's not clear exactly where all those responsibilities are going to sit. There's also a huge gap in terms of knowing where we're going forward on that agenda. So it's not, again, big gap as to where we go after January the 1st, if you like. So that's the first set of negotiations with the EU. The second type are the negotiations of rollover or continuity agreements. So the EU had negotiated more than just about any other jurisdiction globally a whole lot of free trade agreements that we were party to by virtue of the fact we were EU member state. So we needed immediately to create replacement deals to make sure there wasn't trade disruption with Brexit. So we needed trade deals with 60 plus countries, which was approximately 13% of our trade. So if you think of roughly half of our trade was with the EU, another 13% of our trade is then governed with these third-party FTAs that we've been trying to replicate. You might have heard over the weekend we agreed one with Japan. So the biggest out of all these different replicating deals that we needed to create were Japan, which is worth 2% of our total trade, and Canada. So Canada came in over the weekend and is essentially a replication of the EU-Canada deal, but is they're going to next year negotiate a bespoke one. So I think Canada was waiting to see what the UK-EU deal was. It hasn't got clarity on that, so they've sort of making sure that trade isn't disrupted on January the 1st. They've punted the future relationship between the UK and Canada to next year to be negotiated. So the only one that we've seen that's got substantial changes is the UK-Japan agreement. And there we've got quite big changes on digital, and that's where I think we can start to see this shift and this regulatory realignment towards a sort of Asia-Pacific and US way of regulating certainly that part of the economy. And then the third type of trade agreements that we should be aware of are just the ones that are sort of genuinely new, if you like. So where the EU doesn't have a trade agreement, and there are not many of those. The big one to watch is the United States. So it's by far the most significant, just in terms of just the sheer trade volume, about 16% of UK trade in 2019. So outside the EU, that's our biggest trading partner. And the big issue, so there's two things I think to mention there. One is that in terms of the aggregate GDP impact, it's not going to make up anything like for the economic loss of moving away from the EU. So just to give you some of one estimate there, it's expected to generate 0.2% of GDP boost over 15 years. So nothing like the sort of making up for that 5% loss of GDP from a FTA with the EU. But the big issue, I think, for all of us is the extent to which the UK is going to look to align its regulatory alignment with the US model and the US way of doing things. We actually don't have much insight, not even people that are sitting on government advisory boards. The government's been really keeping it very quiet about what it's doing. we do know that negotiations are now covering at least 30 different areas. They've moved quite quickly. They're in text-based negotiations in just about all of that. So on all the types of areas I've mentioned, there are now legal texts. I do think the Biden administration is going to be a game changer there. So the fact that we've now, the Trump administration, I think would have, if had Trump been re-elected, we would have had a deal quite quickly. I think the Biden administration will really look to take stock. I think we'll see quite significant differences in environment and labour. And I can go into detail, but the US legislative framework means we'd need a deal by Easter, which I think is now unlikely. So I think the US ones are going to be slower, and actually that gives us a bit of time to breathe, I hope. The only other ones I would think you should have on your agenda are the ones with New Zealand and Australia, and our possible accession to the CPTPP, which was that big Trans-Pacific Partnership one that President Trump pulled out of, but the other 11 countries went ahead. And there I think the UK spent a lot of time talking about our accession to that agreement, and that agreement is in a way aligned with the US regulatory models. There's a sort of US Asia Pacific way of regulating, and again, happy to go into details what that looks like, but it seems that that's where we're headed. So that's the overview of the where we're at on the trade negotiations front. Of course, beyond all of that, there's a huge amount of work just going to set up all the institutions. We're creating a trade remedies authority, a general tariff, all the infrastructure at the border, because we've not had to have the kind of border customs checks, all of that regulation. I think we still haven't got there. Plus all our trade preferences with developing countries. There is a huge amount going on. Let me come then to the second part. Or let me add to say, in the area of trade policy generally, I think the other big gap that we've seen is it's not clear how the trade policy and this quite fast move to align UK trade policy and strike new deals aligns with things like the green industrial policy, which we saw launched last week. So our trade agreements so far they haven't embedded this idea of a green industrial policy or industrial strategy into the trade objectives. If you look at the US agreement or others, there's not much alignment there. We're hosting COP26, but there's nothing that the UK is saying about green industrial policy. There's lots of commitments to level up. There's no real clarity on how the UK thinks it's going to get jobs and generate jobs or make the economy more competitive. So the Department for International Trade seems to be going about this without necessarily a clarity of sort of how it feeds into other parts of Whitehall. Okay, let me speak then to the parliamentary scrutiny question and where we're at. So from a public policy point of view, I think we all want sort of an evidence-based trade policy that's the outcome of consultation and deliberation, as well as part of parliamentary oversight. Just to say that stakeholder consultation is pretty weak, and I won't go into details, but I'd be happy to talk to that. What I will talk to now in detail is the extent of parliamentary scrutiny, how trade agreements are ratified in the UK and how that compares with others. I'll keep that at a fairly headline level, and you can look into the paper if you want more details on it. But what we've done is we've compared, but we're looking at both the formal powers of the legislative branch vis-a-vis the executive, as well as the informal practices and the extent of collaboration between the two. And they range from a sort of executive-dominated traditions, of which the UK falls, all the way to the United States, where we've got a legislative branch, Congress, that keeps the executive on a very tight rein. Okay, so that's the sort of, if you like, there's a whole spectrum of ways of doing the trade scrutiny and that relationship between the executive and the legislative branch. So in the UK then, our system is very much dominated by the executive. We have what's called the royal prerogative. So ministers in the UK can enter into international treaties. They can deploy troops without parliamentary approval. Right? So it's not only trade agreements, it's all international treaties. So we have a dualist legal system, which means those treaties don't have direct effect in our UK law, which means that the executive branch negotiates the treaty, the legislative branch then implements legislation to give effect to those international obligations. So the traditional role of Parliament has been focused on scrutinising that implementing legislation. Right, so they kind of let the executive branch get on with it when it comes to negotiation and just scrutinise the implementing legislation. And I'm going to talk to why I think that's quite a significant problem for accountability. But the key point then is that Parliament doesn't get involved until that treaty has basically been negotiated. So the rationale, traditionally, we've had quite a big division between domestic and foreign affairs. So Parliament's role was always sort of said to stop at the water's edge. And the rationale for that was that the argument was you want an unencumbered executive on the international stage, so that they can act in the national interest. That's been there's a long-standing genre of criticism of that approach. Just to take the English constitutional expert Walter Bagehot from the 1870s, I think he wrote this. He said, treaties are quite as important as most laws, and to require the elaborate assent of representative assemblies to every word of the law, but not to consult them even as to the essence of a treaty, is prima facie ludicrous. Right, so this idea that we just let the executive go off and do whatever it wants on treaties really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So the UK Parliament's role is set under what's called the CRAG Act, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. And essentially it sets out that, in the paper we've looked at different stages of negotiations. The pre-negotiation stage, when the objectives are set, the extent of oversight during the negotiations, and then what happens after negotiations at the ratification stage. So under the CRAG Act, there is no formal right of our Parliament to have any say on the mandate or the objective. So there's no sort of objective setting function at all. Our Parliament has no formal right to information during the negotiating process. And then after negotiations, the treaty can, although ministers, there is an exception if ministers deem that they don't need or don't want to for emergency reasons. But in general, the treaty should be laid before Parliament for 21 sitting days. At that point, Parliament scrutinises the agreement, but crucially, Parliament does not have the power to reject the agreement. The most it can do is to delay ratification by 21 days. In theory, the Parliament can then repeatedly delay ratification. In practice, it's quite a cumbersome process to invoke that delay mechanism, and it's never been used. So that's the if you like the main power that Parliament has. There's no guarantee of a debate or a vote of an agreement on the floor of the House. So in theory, it's 21 days that it sits before Parliament. MPs can then shout and say we don't like it, and they can delay it by 21 days, but that's the most they can do. So the role of Parliament then is to scrutinise the implementing legislation. Now the issue is then, in tandem with the treaty, the government's supposed to then prepare the implementing bill, so that implementing legislation. So the idea is that's what Parliament is scrutinising. But if you think about it, even like with the UK-Japan deal, at that point it's too late to shape the treaty text. So Parliament's left with a take it or leave it at that point. So diplomatically, it's incredibly hard to influence an agreement that's already been formed, if you like, and agreed with the international counterparty. So there's a real risk of diplomatic upset, which means most parliaments are going to be very reluctant to shout at the end of the day. They do, as we saw with the Brexit negotiations, if they really don't like something. But in general, you can see why the politics means they sort of nod things through, particularly in our kind of majoritarian parliamentary system. But the other thing, and this I think has had much less airtime in the discussions, is that a lot of the public policy issues that we care about, or that citizens care about, don't require new primary legislation, so aren't in an implementing bill. Okay, so something like food standards, chlorine washed chicken. So these are food standards. The power to regulate food standards has been repatriated from Europe now. So we now have obviously the power to decide what the UK food standards are going to be. But the power to change UK food standards sits now with the minister. Parliament doesn't need to get involved. Okay, so a lot of those powers have come back from Brussels, but actually either can be done directly by the minister or require secondary legislation, so aren't going to be ratified or scrutinised. And this creates a big gap. So I haven't sat down, I think it's quite a big job, it would be great to do, which is to look at the whole suite of changes that are likely to be policy changes that are likely to come with a trade agreement, and just see which ones actually require primary legislation. My suspicion is that not many of them. Because the other thing that trade agreements do is then commit the government not to do things in future. So, for example, the UK-Japan agreement has clauses in there that say we will not introduce, for example, data localization requirements in future. We don't use them now, right? So there's no need for us to change primary legislation. But that, in effect, we're now entering into an international commitment. That means if Parliament were to change its mind in future and say we want to implement data localization, it has the sovereign right to do that under the UK Constitution, but it would be a breach of that international agreement. And as you probably know, international agreements come with sanctions, right? So were we to do that, the counterparty to that agreement can then impose trade sanctions, or investor state cases can be brought against us. So to quite an important extent, we now have a situation where the executive branch can make quite important, I think, public policy changes without scrutiny from Parliament, but which will constrain Parliament's ability to act in future. The other thing to say about the UK, and I'll come back to this in a minute when I explain what happens in other countries, is that there's a lot of tension, as you've probably picked up, with our devolved administrations. So under the Civil Convention, we're supposed to consult with devolved administrations whenever we're doing things that impinge on or have an impact on their areas of devolved competence. But there's a bit of a gap, because the CRAG Act, so the act that governs treaty ratification, says nothing about the formal rights of devolved administrations vis-a-vis international treaty negotiations. So at the moment, there's no obligation to consult with, say, the Scottish Government or the Welsh Assembly in terms of what we do in a trade negotiation, which is causing all manner of tensions. And again, the government has said no, allowing them any kind of veto power would constrain the executive as it goes out to negotiate in the national interest, right? So again, this is where we're getting quite a lot of tension at the moment. Then we compare with what happens elsewhere and explain why actually our trade agreements will have less scrutiny than they had when we were part of the EU. So let me start with the United States, just because it's the most extreme case, if you like, of where the legislative branch actually has a lot of control. So under the US Constitution, the US Congress is responsible for trade. Not actually other parts of foreign policy, but it is for trade and commerce. And what happens in practice is that the Congress delegates that authority to the executive branch under what's called the Trade Promotion Authority, which is a sort of primary legislation that exists in practice for about 5 years. So the Congress delegates the power to make trade agreements to the executive branch, to the US Trade Representative, but it really holds a very tight rein, and it does so in different ways. So the first thing that it does is it sets up the objectives that the executive branch has to follow in primary legislation. So if you read the Trade Promotion Authority, that act, you will see in great detail, for example, I think it's 2015, I think the most recent one is, thou shalt not say anything about climate change. It's not quite in those terms, but it's in there, right? So they set out in great detail exactly what the objectives are that the US executive branch then needs to go and negotiate. For any specific negotiation, like negotiations with the UK, then Congress has to be consulted on those specific objectives as well. So they get they both sort of in terms of primary legislation, set out very clear stipulations. They also require quite deep consultation on the very specifics. During the negotiations, representatives of Congress and their staffers get access to all the confidential texts. Okay, unlike our MPs, who have no right to any access during this time, they also have the right to observe what's actually happening in the negotiating room. So again, there's a sort of oversight there. Ratifications, that final stage, there's a lot of time that they have, typically 3 months, so a lot longer than the 21 sitting days in the UK. There's a lot of time before, they both get to see the text before it's signed, as well as after signature, before it's laid in Congress. So there's a lot more time for scrutiny. But the crucial point, and this is the absolute crucial point, is the assent of both houses is required. So you need a majority in the Senate and the House of Representatives to get a trade deal through. 2 caveats here. So one is that there's quite a lot of tension between the states. So areas like government procurement are actually a sort of state level competence, as well as some things around professional regulations, etc. So professional licensing, like if you're an accountant. So there's quite a lot of tension between what the executive branch does and then these devolved competencies that sit with states. So that's the US has got quite a lot of problems there. The other thing, and we can discuss this, is that arguably Congress and the Senate, there's quite a lot of evidence of capture by businesses, which mean that they can sort of hold, if you like, trade negotiations up. So you get sort of regulatory capture happening through Congress, and because it has so much oversight. So it's not a perfect system by any means, but what I think is striking is the extent to which Congress can hold the executive to account and stipulate those regulations. Then we come to the EU. So the EU is a kind of intermediate case. So we focus there on looking at the role of the European Parliament. And since 2009 in the Lisbon Treaty, now the consent of the European Parliament is required for any trade agreement that the EU negotiates. The negotiations are conducted by the European Commission on behalf of the EU member states. And since 2009, essentially the European Parliament has a veto role. And because of that, it now has been able to exercise quite a lot of influence. So it doesn't have any formal right to be consulted in terms of the negotiating objectives, but precisely because the European Commission negotiators know that it has the right to veto at the end, they sort of play it back and realise that if they don't consult early on, they're going to have trouble at the ratification stage. So what we see now is you can see it through, for example, the trade and sustainable development chapters that have been inserted. The European Parliament's become more and more active in explaining what it wants, and there has been able to influence what actually happens in the negotiating room. It also has the right to information. So EU citizens have right to information, and MEPs have a lot more right to information. So like the US Congress, and unlike UK parliamentarians, MEPs have access to all those confidential texts. Okay. What is interesting about the EU is that the EU has a very public approach. So after each negotiating round, it typically puts its legal text that it's just proposed in the negotiating room. It puts that in the public domain. So you've got quite a good sense of where the EU's at. So you can't see obviously what the other counterparty is doing or the consolidated text. Parliamentarians can, but the public has a much higher level of access to information. So there's a situation where the legislative branch has got a high level of influence, even though it doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of formal power, but it does have that veto card. I'll quickly just talk to the Canada and Australia, just to say they're very similar to the UK. So they have a very similar Westminster system. I mean, their sort of constitution has come from the UK model. So they're very much dominated by the executive branch. And similarly to the UK, Parliament only gets involved at the end of the process. But two things to note, or perhaps three. Canada has a very effective way of involving its provinces.